My name is Heather. I'm just going to be acting as the host and moderator throughout this panel, but we're really the three people surrounding me are the stars of the show. We have Eileen Ward, who is a product design consultant for Batovi, Levi Myers, who is the director of product design for Batovi, and Paul Herzog, who is the assistant director of Agile development. So we're really excited to have all three of these leaders in their industry with us today, decades of experience between the three of them. So really insightful stuff coming at you. And again, there is a handout, an agenda in the handout section. So feel free to take a look at that. There's also some helpful links at the bottom if you want to connect with us at the end of this discussion. We are always happy to answer questions through our Slack channel. Anything that you've got, we are ready for it. All right, let's get started. People can trickle on in as we get things going, but I just introduced our panelists, Eileen, Levi, and Paul. We're really excited to have them with us today. So today we are talking about product design and building better apps through more collaboration across the product design and product development teams. And I want to start with just some foundational information. So Eileen, if we could ask you kind of what the roles of a designer is throughout the typical product development workflow.
Sure. Hi, I'm Eileen. I'm a product designer at Batovi. I think about product development in three major phases. So you have discovery, design, and development. So you might think that designers really only play a major role in the first two phases. And while that might be true, collaboration is key throughout all three of these phases. So starting with discovery, the goal of discovery is really to mitigate risk by making sure that we've done all our research and we are going to be designing and eventually building the right thing. Trying to get it right the first time so that we can save ourselves time, money, and work later on. So in the discovery process, designers take kind of a leadership role alongside other leaders. So we'd be working with stakeholders who represent the business side and who are representing the business needs. They might be paying attention to KPIs. We are working alongside engineering leaders who are familiar with the infrastructure of the way the apps or products run. And we're also working alongside customers and users to make sure that their needs are being met. And then we also really want to make sure that we are keeping this discovery process kind of open and transparent to the rest of the team, including the developers, because they're very smart people with lots of great ideas. And getting people involved early on is going to help us mitigate that risk later. So this process is kind of divergent and then convergent. So first, we start with the universe of ideas, and we kind of diverge and explore, and then we kind of converge, figure out what everybody's needs are, the business and the users, and we define what the app or product should look like. This kind of divergent and convergent process can take the form of general like research methodologies like interviewing and surveying, heuristic evaluation, competitive analysis. We might be doing workshops with our internal teams or with users or stakeholders. We might be doing some co-designing and like sketching, rapid ideation. The outcomes of this might be artifacts like research reports, personas, journey maps, user flows. There's so many different things that you can come out of a discovery phase with. And again, we really want to make sure that we are posting those artifacts in a public place where the rest of the team can see it, including developers. We want everybody to have access to as much information as possible. And then once all of that phase is kind of wrapping up, we have this general idea of what the needs are and how we might go about meeting them. And we enter this like design phase where we want to bring those ideas to life. We want to take, requirements and turn them into something something real. That could be we might start with something like low fidelity, some sketches, lo-fi wireframes, eventually moving into high fidelity designs. And then what's really great is getting to the point of prototypes where we can test them. And we can test with users, of course. But we can also run designs by stakeholders and developers. We want to get as much feedback as possible from as many different perspectives as possible so that we can make sure we are designing the right thing and then reiterate from there. We definitely want to vet with developers before showing it to people who are either giving the final approval of the designs or showing it with like the last round of users before moving on to development. So then when we are moving over to development, you might think designers don't really play much of a role. We hand off these designs and then it's in the developer's hands. But that's a very waterfall way to look at things. And we're going to get into more conversation later about why that just isn't necessarily the best scenario. When we're handing off, as designers, when we're handing off our designs, we want to make sure that they are kind of done in a way that is best for the developers. Again, we'll get more into that later. And we want to be available to the developers throughout the development phase. So we're not just handing these things off and then playing absolutely no role. We want to be available to answer their questions, clarify things, and then also be there to do design QA on what has been built and maybe even facilitate some testing and validation on what has been built. So that's a little bit about what a designer does throughout the workflow, but I'd love to hear from Paul about how product ownership plays a role throughout this process.
Yeah, so my team at Pitovi, product owner, product management type role, tends to play the other side of the product coin from design. So design is very much about the how and the why. A lot of times product ownership is much more about the what and the when. So we need to work very closely together, starting in that early discovery phase about making sure that we understand the business workflows, that we can document, user stories and start to build a backlog in a way that makes sense and connects with the design the whole way. So as we're going through these low fidelity wireframes, we're also looking at it from a technical dependency perspective and just a usability as a user story perspective to say, is this something that we can build? Is there a better way from an engineering perspective to make this same thing? And how do we know that this needs to happen before that? And if we need to build it in a certain order, both to best meet the designs as well as to best meet the end need of the customer, because the whole point is we're building these user stories is to keep focusing on that iterative business value that we can deliver as often as possible, rather than, again, we don't want to work waterfall and wait until the end and you get the whole thing. Like Mr. Customer, we'd like to know what you think. Here's low fidelity. What do you think on the sketch? Here's high fidelity. What do you think of the design? Now that you have your hands on real working clickable software, what do you think of that? And in small iterative pieces.
That's awesome. Thank you to both of you. And so now we kind of want to get a foundation for what the typical product development team structure looks like, and both from a development and a product design standpoint. So Levi, we'll start with you in terms of what are the different team structures that you might typically see in design?
Yeah, I mean, typically it would fall into either centralized, decentralized, or kind of a hybrid of those. And those come with really different typical working formats of how design and development and wider teams can work together. With your centralized structures, you'd have all the designers kind of working same team, reporting up through a design structure. That's most common at agencies. And you'd have within that structure, the designers are very connected with other designers, typically not very connected with developers. That model is great for having a great diversity of skills on a team, allowing for specialization within design. Designers can collaborate and learn from each other easily. But on the downside, it's got the highest likelihood of the different structures to be really siloed away from developers. You've got the developers and the rest of the teams, PMs and everyone really less exposed to design. And you've also got a lot of kind of the individual teams, because design isn't inherently part of them. They're sort of evaluating for themselves whether or not they think that their project needs design. And so it because they aren't as educated about design, because they're not working as closely alongside it, and then they are kind of in control of how much design is added to their teams, it can be a real mismatch of whether appropriate design gets assigned to projects. With a decentralized team, it kind of flips the script, where designers are part of cross-functional teams, typically based around like a product or a feature, and then they're reporting up through that cross-functional team structure, kind of in an operations perspective. And they'd be part of teams of like designers and POs, PMs, developers, maybe some other specialized roles like testers or researchers. You see that one common at startups. It's fairly frequent at in-house teams at companies that don't have a strong design culture. And within that structure, the developers and the designers are very connected, the entire team. But the designers on that team are typically very disconnected from other designers at the organization. So the upsides of that model, you've got design as kind of a core part of the project throughout. It's a given because that person is embedded as part of that team. You've got great long-term exposure for that designer across those projects. They're building up really good domain knowledge. But on the downside, because of how the team is structured, there's often very little or no time for upfront work because everybody on the team is kind of starting at the same time. There's a lack of awareness of what designers at the organization are each working on. So there might be a real, repeated work, lack of personal growth coming through that. And then one of the real implications there, this kind of structure is one where there's the highest need for tools like design systems to keep these disparate teams doing things that are consistent. But because there's no centralized structure, they're also the least likely to have one because each team is just focused on their own thing. And then the last model there, the hybrid one, it combines both. So you've kind of got two levels of management across the design side and then through the product team side. So with those, the people they're part of a design team, but they're assigned to specific projects. With them, they're most common in large organizations that can kind of support multiple levels of management. And it's also a model that's kind of inherent with consulting, where with Pitovi, we've got our design team, but then our people on our team are all working with our clients, and some of them on the same projects, some of them on different projects. So you end up with a kind of a combination. There's connection to the designers as well as the developers. It's a model that adds more flexibility than the other two. And has a lot of the benefits of both the centralized and decentralized structures, but with the downside that because there's that additional level of overhead, it both costs a bit more, and then there's potential of confusion around like who am I actually reporting to on these things, because there's these different structures for reporting.
Yeah. And so, Paul, then can you speak to it from the development side, like what your typical team structure looks like?
Sure. So I think at Pitovi, we're kind of big believers in like the pizza principle when it comes to sizing Scrum teams or Agile teams. And that's, like you don't want to have a meeting or you don't want to have a group that's too big that you can't feed it with a pizza. So that typically means there's like 4 to 6 engineering team members between software development and testing, and how that balances out a lot of times depends on the type of project that it is. But then there's going to be this what we call a TPO, a technical product owner role at Pitovi. That person on my team or myself comes from a background of business analysis or Scrum Master or something, and we tend to play both of those roles in helping build the backlog, run the ceremonies that come with delivery, and going from there. And then the designer is also, we view that as a key integral part of having somebody on that team. So to speak to a specific example, the client that I'm currently on, and Eileen was on that project for a while. We have multiple Scrum teams, each with 4 or 5 people on them, and then both Eileen as well as designers from the client side in a blended model are part of that organization as well. So Eileen is participating in a lot of those ceremonies. Other people are working across that, sometimes not as much as you'd like. And we'll talk about the challenges that come with some of that as well. But the intent is always there, that the designer is as much a part of the Scrum team as anybody else is, and participating in all 3 of the phases that Eileen talked about earlier, as the rest of the team delivers as well.
And I love that you dovetailed right into what we're going into next, is just the challenges that you guys face as you're collaborating amongst design and product and development, but with all these different team structures, like what works, what doesn't. You have a lot of experience to speak to this. So we can talk to Levi first in terms of a challenge that you've seen, and then sort of how you've parsed through that.
Yeah. So, we've titled this of a narrow design focus, and there's kind of a lot of things that can lead to this and outcomes from it. And, largely it's stemming from not as much collaboration as is needed for across business leaders and stakeholders, users. It can come out of clients feeling like they've already got it all locked down. And anyone who's worked in a consulting model has probably run into some things like that. An example I worked on was with a library project. And so we were talking with the stakeholders at the library, and they're like, oh, yeah, I mean, you can talk to the library patrons if you want to, but, we've got a really good idea here, exactly what they're looking for. And they went into this big laundry list of all of these things that the library patrons were really looking for. And then we went out and actually talked to the patrons, did some interviews, did some surveys. And what the patrons were actually looking for was a complete disconnect. There wasn't one piece of overlap between what the stakeholders had said people want and what they actually wanted. And what the people wanted wasn't a surprise to me, because it was what I had also kind of assumed, which is people were really interested in improvements to the catalog for finding the materials, better connections with their ebooks, things like that, and not more connection on what's happening with the city and things like that the library stakeholders had really been focusing on. But yeah, I mean, overall, if you allow whatever the reason for it is of not going through as deep of that process as you need for the kind of strategic upfront parts there, you really run that risk of the product isn't going to meet the end user's needs. You'll have those challenges where you're duplicating efforts, you're coming through things, and the outcome is it's very inefficient. It's expensive because you're essentially coming to these discovery pieces later in the project rather than having done them up front. And at that point, you've already invested a lot into the process. You've done some work that you're going to have to redo. So that's the kind of risks that are coming through here. And to address that, it's obviously best to preempt it. It's hard to address retroactively. So you want to come into a project having allocated enough time for that discovery process. You need to make sure that you're involving and aligning with the business, your stakeholders, your users, making sure that they have that shared vision, making sure that they're aligned on what the objectives are, what the key results that everyone's looking for are. And if we're coming in later in a project and identifying we didn't really do enough up front, sometimes you can do that as a, like, let's go away and do this, and the work can continue. Sometimes you'll have to kind of have the whole project come to a bit of a halt to do that. But either way, there has to be an acceptance at that point that there's going to be some rework, because if you're noticing it that late in the process, it's because things are cropping up that have been done incorrectly so far.
I think it's funny that Levi, you haven't spent years and years and years at Petovi. You had other places, and then you came here not all that long ago. I've got many years of consulting experience, but I've only been at Petovi about 6 months, maybe a little less. And yet the story you tell is the constant story that I hear over and over and over, that I've experienced throughout my consulting career, where stakeholders come to you and say, we've got this set of requirements, we've done all the research, here's what we know about the application we have, people like it, they don't like it, and basically what we just need is like a reskin of the front end and new designs and maybe a new front end technology. Like, can you build us something in React because it's in Windows Forms right now and it just looks old? And then you talk to the actual users, and the story you get is so much different than that narrative of people love our application and they just want a new front end. It's astounding. Like, if I could just have a magic wand to say that everybody gets over themselves a little bit and lets us help guide them in that process, we would all just be so much better off, because we have a repeatable process to have these conversations and to establish a North Star and establish user personas and journeys as part of that discovery, and distill that into a requirement map, and to be able to do all of that. And we know how to have those conversations as the outsider in ways that people who are inside of our clients' companies don't. And it's just, we just come from it from a different perspective, and are trained and are experts in how to have those conversations.
Yeah, I see in the chat that Erica had said that it happens with in-house teams too, which is very true. One of the things I find is really effective for bringing some of that alignment, especially if you're getting a sense of maybe disbelief that, we've done so much work with our users already, and you're telling us something that is different from what we've heard. Is sharing some of those the usability test result videos or interview videos where people are really diving into their frustrations in a very tangible way. It can be very enlightening for people who haven't seen some of that.
Yeah, and Erica mentions that it's an insider's bias. I think that's exactly what you guys are touching on. That's awesome. So Eileen, let's hear from you about, something that you've noticed as a product design consultant.
Yeah, I think it's kind of related to the point that was just made in a way. So a challenge that I'm particularly passionate about is when design is kind of happening in a vacuum. This is related to something we talked about already earlier. I worked on a project recently where we had a bit of a centralized model. It was centralized, but we were transitioning to a more hybrid model. But for the most part, the design team was a bit siloed from the rest of the developers and the rest of the product teams. We, as designers, were not exactly assigned to a cross-functional squad. We were really kind of working on our own timelines and with our own kind of requirements, just in a separate space. We had our own stand-ups. Everything was very siloed and separate. So what ended up happening was we were working directly with the product teams, meaning like product management and people representing the business. And so we were, and there wasn't a lot of time allotted for user research, which is directly related to what Levi was just saying. But aside from that, we were coming up with all these great ideas to meet the business needs. And so the way this was kind of structured was the business, sorry, the board, like had this idea of something that they wanted to accomplish, and they had a very tight budget and therefore a very tight timeline. And so we came up with what that might look like to meet their needs, gave that to a developer. The developer cranked out some estimates. Here's what I think, here's how we might be able to get it done in this short amount of time. And we were off to the races. The designers were kind of locked in a room with these product managers and business stakeholders who were, first of all, their wants and needs kept expanding. So we were having this like scope creep. And we didn't have any developers in the room to say like, that's not possible, we can't do that, or that doesn't match our time estimates of what we've already committed to. That's going to change our roadmap. That's going to create blockers. There was no one in the room to say anything about any of that. So we're just creating these designs, and we're in high fidelity, and we're, completely overhauling a design system and creating all these new features and enhancing old features. And the risk there is that it's, first of all, very waterfall, right? Everything gets done and then it's handed off to developers. They're thinking, A, this doesn't look anything like what we estimated or we're expecting to get. We're terrified now that we're not going to be able to get this done in time. We don't know if it's even feasible to get this done, how we're going to do it. And I think another little challenge to this is, as designers, we're creating things we don't know how easy or how difficult it is going to be to create, to make. It's one thing to design something in Figma and maybe do a little bit of research to figure out, all right, what kind of lift might this be? But if you don't have someone technical looking at it, you don't know if you how tall your ask is. So yeah, what ends up happening is the designs are not feasible, and then you're back to the drawing board and you have to design again. Or they're feasible, but now it's going to take a lot longer than was estimated. So now your timeline and your budget is expanding, which either means you're going to deliver late, or some other feature is going to be on the chopping block and it's not going to make it into the next release or into this version of the product. So why does this happen? I think dev time is not allotted to be, as a developer, right? You have a certain number of hours in the week, just like everybody else, the same amount of time that Beyonce has. And, your time is valuable. If you're a consultant, maybe you charge by the hour. If you're an employee, you get paid a salary. Your time is valuable, right? So a lot of stakeholders tend to think, well, the most valuable way, or the most efficient way to get the greatest value out of a developer's time is to have them sitting in a chair coding. That's how I'm going to get my money's worth. And so I don't want them in meetings that they don't need to be in, or I don't need them to be part of design because they're not designers. But I think that's really a miscalculation to allot a small amount of a developer's time to vet designs or just pop into a design workshop now and then to check in on things, or to just be available in Slack. That small investment could save you a lot of money later on, making sure that you're not designing things that are not feasible or bloating your timelines and your budgets. So yeah, I think allot some time for developers, include them early on, get buy-in, and don't forget that developers are creative too, and they have great ideas.
I love that. And Erica and Chris, these comments are right on, right? Like the context of making sure that everyone who's involved is always involved. This is really cool. And then Paul, I'd love to hear from you, like a slightly different perspective, right? What are things that you've seen, encountered, and kind of the way you go about solving those things?
So I'll speak to a couple other things other than what Eileen mentioned about designing something that can't be built. A lot of times, just when you get too far ahead, developers have to make a couple of concessions that either the requirements change, and requirements change all the time, and Agile is built on the idea of changing requirements. So if design gets that far ahead and works in more of a waterfall fashion where I've built the series of high fidelity screens for everything that we need to do, when those requirements change, not only am I as a product manager dealing with those changes from a functionality and a development perspective, but now I have to go back to the designer and say, oh, by the way, we're not doing this or that anymore. Now we're doing something else. So you need to redesign parts A, B, and C of this piece of it because we go. Um, the testers have to look at a design that might be out of sync or old and identify, well, wait, all right, so, whether it's testers or even like a design QA process of the designers looking at what's been implemented to see if it matches the global patterns and the design standards we need. All of that change is just in flux all the time. Um, but beyond that, you're also running into just a pure expectation perspective with your stakeholders. The best way to get a stakeholder really excited about their new thing is to show them a picture of what their new thing is going to look like. And once you put that image in their head, it's really, really hard to take out. So as things change, as we say, well, we've had all this scope creep, maybe you're only going to get 60% of this in the MVP. We've set ourselves up for failure right away. We have these great pictures. We have these beautiful designs that are going to make an awesome product. When we can't deliver that for you yet, for changing requirements, not having the right team, other infrastructure problems, just MVP scope, whatever factors that might be, now you're just letting somebody down. If we design more incrementally, along with the development piece, a good example I have is if you've ever applied for a loan or specifically a mortgage, and there's pages and pages, there's hundreds of forms to fill out, there's huge amounts of data that they need to give you and documents that need to be provided. Build each little section of that mortgage app and design it as you're going rather than designing the whole thing right away, so that you're staying just in time with the development needs. If the developers have a question, you're not having to go back and look at something that you designed 5 months ago to say, oh, what were we thinking there again? Why are these columns in this order? I don't even remember this. If you've just had that conversation, and I'll even plan to say, we're having like a design sprint, the designers are like a sprint or two ahead of where the development need is going to be for these components, for this part of this workflow, or for this screen. And that's the focus of it. And designers can review that with dev as it feeds into backlog refinement, as it feeds into sprint planning, and as it feeds into actually writing the code and testing it to develop the thing. You are as close to in real time and in sync with everybody as you can be, rather than this model of, we built it all 5 months ago, half of what we need has changed, and now we have to adapt and rework. Erica is exactly right. It is all about trust with the stakeholders who have budgeted money and made promises upstream to their customers, their management, to say, look, yeah, you're going to get your new thing. I know you're paying all this money for it. You're going to get it, and it's going to be great. And you're just setting yourself up for failure if you overpromise that way. That some of Agile doesn't talk about it that way, but that really is part of the value of Agile, is to be able to keep rolling out these small incremental improvements and this incremental business value. So rather than in one big chunk, you're kind of getting good stuff as often as you can.
One of the really tactical things I like from a product design perspective for addressing some of that, because like you said, it's like however just in time you're trying to do it, there's some level of the design is happening before the development. It just has to be that way. And we can talk about like sprint ahead versus like actual just in time on design teams, but because there's this inevitability of the design is changing and is being worked on, there becomes this question, and Chris might particularly like this as a tester, which is what has changed from when the sprint started and now there's like this new feature being worked on that's kind of related to it. Has this impacted this previous story? And one of the things that Figma can do that is super beneficial for addressing this is working in branches where you've got a main branch that is, okay, this is your live, like this is good to go. This is what is in sprint. And then every other feature that you're working on in a branch. You can iterate as much as you want. It's not impacting what's going on in your main branch. There's no questions about what's actually supposed to be in the story. You can actually link to your branches if you want to have like historical traceability on things. And then start of a new sprint, we push all of our branches into the main branch, and you're good to go with design that everybody is aligned on. This is what's in this sprint.
Yeah, I just want to keep letting you guys talk, but the incorrect implementation, like I want it. So the work has kind of been done by the design team, and then what happens?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to segue from talking about how stakeholders fall in love with designs, right? We were saying that. All right, so let's say, we've talked a lot about the beginning of this whole process, making sure that we collaborate with users and we're designing the right thing, making sure we're collaborating with devs and that the thing we designed is actually going to work, making sure that the requirements are not like changing all the time, and that we can get to the point where things are built. So now we're at this point, and like I said earlier, sometimes in certain team structures and organizational structures or workflows, designers can get to the point of handoff and then just kind of say like, okay, my job is done and I have more design work to go back to, and that's where I'm most valuable, so I'm going to focus on that. And what can happen is that developers take these designs and whatever was given to them, and they're doing their absolute best to build what is in the designs and what is in the requirements and meet their acceptance criteria, and then it's done, and maybe it goes to some sort of QA or UAT, right? But I worked in a role for a while for a Fortune 10 company, a big tech company. I was a design QA there, and what I often saw was that things that were built were nowhere near expected. The designs were impeccably done. And when I would go check in staging environments how these things looked, they did not look correct. And we weren't talking like off by, a couple of pixels. We're talking complete designs were just absolutely nowhere near where they should have been. But I was working with developers that I was very comfortable with, and I knew that they were very capable and competent, and talented. And so my question was kind of like, how did this happen? Why did this happen? And as a design QA, it was my job to, mark up everything wrong that I saw and hand it back to them, which can be really disheartening, discouraging, frustrating for everybody, because then we're doing this back and forth. The risk here is that potentially things are falling through the cracks, and what ends up getting, delivered and to end users is not what was designed. It's not meeting the same standards that the designers were shooting for. And that's really a tragedy at a big company like this, where you have some of the best design talent maybe in the world that are creating these things, and that's getting lost in translation. Or what can end up happening is you have this back and forth. And so, products are going from, okay, they're development done, they go to design QA, oh, there's problems, they're going back to the developer, back to the design QA, and you end up spending a lot of time, and that becomes expensive. The backlog is growing, more and more bugs, a lot more to track, and the whole entire project can just bloat. So it's not good. It's not good for anybody. So the question is, like, again, why does this happen? So my instinct is that this happens for probably one of three reasons. One, the developer misinterpreted the designs. Two, the definition of done for the developer did not account for the design done. Or 3, developers are incentivized in one way or another by the organization at large to play hot potato with their tickets. And what I mean by that is they could potentially they might be monitored, meaning someone is watching how quickly they are marking their tasks as done, and someone is maybe monitoring their velocity. And so they are being kind of quote unquote graded on how quickly they can close tickets rather than the value of the work they're doing and how close we're getting to being done with the project as a whole. So the solution is also threefold. So if the developer is misinterpreting the designs, I would recommend that the designer be a little more careful about handoff. So 1, demo your done designs with the developer that you believe will be working on that. So face-to-face communication is a tenet of Agile development. We want to be talking to developers and showing, maybe walking them through, this is what is expected, and giving them that first off chance to ask any questions they might have. And then also when you're handing off, after that demo is done, make sure that there are strong documentation links. There are a lot of really great ways to do this. If you're using Zeppelin, there are places to put links in there. In Figma, with every component, there's a place to put documentation. You might be using some sort of word processor like Confluence or Notion, or maybe like in the case of this big company, there could be like an established design system with lots of documentation online, and you could be linking to that. But just provide as much information as possible and make it known to developers, attach it to your designs, and even better, and I know Paul's going to love this one, if you can attach it to the ticket somehow too and make everything linked to each other so that nobody can ever be confused. I know that sounds like a lot of extra work, but it will save you a lot of time in the long run. So if the definition of done does not account for design, I guess that's a time when you would need to work with whoever's like writing these tickets and writing the acceptance criteria, and whoever is like approving done work, and kind of just meet with them and figure out a way to work around that and improve those definitions. And then be available to developers after handoff. So ideally there would be, if you're using Slack, for example, a Slack channel that's just for that. Developers can ask questions to designers, and everything can kind of live in public threads where people can get the answers they need quickly. Instead of just writing comments and tickets that might never get seen, just the more communication, the better. And then allot time for all of the above. This goes back to things I was saying earlier. You know, I think people are like just thinking, well, that's going to take too long and time is so expensive and I don't want to do it. But like I've been saying, that will actually save you time in the long run and therefore also save you money.
I am totally on board with the document as much as you can, link as much as you can together, even if, you know, you're managing your user stories in Jira, there's links back to the Figma or the Zeppelin designs that have that. I'm also a huge fan of tools like Storybook that kind of sit in between the design tools like Figma and the actual code base itself, where you can implement and develop and sort of have a more simple way of creating this design system and having these as shared components. So you're providing that accelerator right there for the developer to say, yes, we need this control, we need this function, we need this view. And by the way, the components are already there and here they are coded and you can just bring them in. And so much of that is just about organization and thought process. I've worked on projects where we end up with like 3 different "are you sure" dialog boxes because there wasn't a good design system in place. There wasn't a good way for the engineers even just to talk to each other really and say, hey, anybody built this dialog box before that I can reuse? They just had their head down. They were hands on keys and they all said, oh, I need to confirm that I deleted this thing. So I'm going to create this little "are you sure" component. And we rolled it out for like the first round of user testing, and people went, why are these like 3 different boxes with 3 different colors and 3 different whatever? And we all went, oops, maybe everybody should have thought about this a touch ahead of time. to know that we've got this shared library and the shared component. And at Pitovi, I think we're big on, pushing for design systems and pushing for global patterns and pushing for all that kind of consistency, and then the use of tools to monitor it the entire way through.
One of the things you'd mentioned, Eileen, was like developers being incentivized kind of to like not focus on the design, which is so true. I worked on a project one time where anything that was design related that wasn't done as part of the story just got added as a bug afterwards, and then they would estimate the bug of like how much effort to do this. And so essentially, it's like the work that should have been and was originally estimated as part of that first story was then being parceled out into a new story that was called a bug, and so that they're getting all of this building the extra velocity, and like you can't really fault the developers when that's the project, like how it has been structured. Like you said, they're just incentivized to do it that way.
And I know we have one more challenge that we want to cover, but I do want to get to Chris's question and kind of take a bit of a detour, because I think you'll all have good things to say about it. How do you approach convincing your stakeholders, your clients, that this is all worth it? Because in his experience, this is challenging. Yeah. And yeah, I'm sure
I'm not going to lie, Chris, it is a challenge. But I will say, I think data is really the key. Like if you're tracking people's time and then let's say you're having a meeting, right? And it's an hour-long meeting, and you're taking notes during the meeting. We're big proponents of that here at Pitovi. And you're keeping minutes and any decisions that were made in the meeting, maybe any action items that came out of the meeting. And you basically have a document of all the value that happened in 1 hour. And then, you can see who was in that meeting, who participated. Obviously, there are people that needed to be there. Maybe there were some people who didn't need to be there. And from there, you can kind of figure out what was the value versus how much time and money was spent. And I think you can take that 1 hour example and you can expand that and like look at maybe a month or a quarter or a project or a certain feature. But I would say, data, just maybe tracking. This is the sprint where we didn't do demos and look what happened. And, it ended up costing us this much time later on, versus then we changed our process and we started doing demos and look how much time we saved.
A lot of times with these challenging clients, it's about, they don't understand, to Eileen's point before about developers, can provide just as much value in other ways than just, my hands are on keys 40 hours a week writing code, or I'm doing nothing but writing requirements. And a lot of times the clients come to us wanting an application or wanting a tech solution to like a cultural challenge. And this sort of thing about the convincing them that this is worth it is typically a cultural challenge. That you haven't built up that trust yet to say, look, can we just, this works, this process is important, having design forethought and having a system in place and having a process for this is all really important. And it's usually not beneficial to ad hoc your way through it. And so saying, we want to take the time to do this. I've had a boss previously that used the phrase, we want to slow down to speed up. And examining these challenges usually can't come until you've suffered enough pain and can show enough data of how much time you've wasted, because you tried to do this all on the fly rather than thinking things through and having a process to integrate the teams earlier. So a lot of times that happens where just your MVP is a trash heap. You get through it, you rework how it goes, and everything you deliver after that tends to go smoother because of the lessons you learned. But you can't learn those lessons until you go through the pain that caused you to do it. Just like most things in life, I think.
Yeah, like it's an area where, regardless of your track record, you're not always going to be able to convince your client or your project that it's something needed. I'll just build on something that Eileen was saying about like working with data. Another kind of aspect here is if you've been doing it for long enough that you've got historical examples that you can like pull out as on, X project, we did this, we changed to this, we saw this kind of a change, particularly if you can be speaking their language in terms of ROI and, cost of changes after the fact. I know Eileen's currently working on a blog of like the 110-100 rule of quality, where it's kind of like how much does it cost for how far that you are into a project, and you can catch it in discovery $1. If it's like into the wild, it's already been released, it's at 100. So that's one aspect of it. The other thing that I would add is you don't always have to ask permission to do all of these things. And I think everybody kind of wants to, if you're changing process, make sure that it's approved. Some things like, I want to do demos with developers. Does that have to be approved? Like, you can just start setting it up. Maybe somebody's going to come and shut you down and say, you're spending too much time doing this. But more often than not, it's not being tracked to that level of precision, or like people didn't have, like, they hadn't set up the project specifically because they wanted something. It was just, that was what they knew. And so if somebody who knows better is wanting to do a slightly different process, they weren't, caring to have to approve that first.
I also think that it's one of our little benefits of being consultants and not working in-house somewhere, is that we don't necessarily have to wait for the well-known problem to happen again at this client, where we've already seen it happen at clients previously. We can use, if we have a good relationship with a certain client and they are viewing us as experts with lots of experience, we can say, we've actually seen this problem on 3 projects we've done before, and here's how we've solved it. And we know the solution works and it will work for you. Whether or not they take that advice is up to them. But, I think a lot of times at organizations, they only know what their history is and what they've done. And maybe, yeah, sure, you could have employees on the team who've come from other organizations and have come from other projects and workflows. But I just think that that's the benefit of working with a consultant, is that we have the experience that you might not have.
We even do webinars about that stuff.
Yep. And we do have one more challenge to tackle. I know we're running a little short on time, but Levi, if you want to speak to this, I think it's really
sure.
insightful.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that all designers can probably relate to, a hot topic item for, I don't know, it seems like it's been the entire time of my 20 plus design career, is how does design fit into Agile? And like, can it? The biggest challenge is when designers are like fully part of the sprint structure. It's very week to week, very tactical. This is the individual thing that we're working on. And there's not that kind of big picture view of like looking at the forest. You're focused on the trees. So the risk there comes in through not having enough time for discovery, not doing enough strategic work before things get going, feeling like you're a roadblock for the development team, that you've got to get some stuff out there so that they can get to work. And too little time available during a sprint to actually run through a design process that is involving some research and some ideation and some testing, some iteration, and then some final work before it is actually ready for development. The other aspect of this is that design is essentially coming in to work through the unknown unknowns, which is to say, like, we're starting at a project, we're identifying the strategic aspects of the project. What is it that this needs to do? We're talking with the users to find out what are their pain points that we need to address. Before we've done that, we don't actually know what the scope of the project is going to be to resolve it. And so trying to fit that into a neat little bundle, we're going to have this all done at the end of this 2-week sprint, and enough done ahead that the development team can actually do the work, is really restrictive from a design perspective. So, to address that, there has to be some kind of big picture work done at the beginning of the project before development starts. The scale of that can vary drastically. You've got your Google design sprint. We're going to knock everything out maybe in a week. You might have a full digital strategy project where it becomes more waterfall-like, and you've got a full strategic piece done beforehand. There's a lot of variation within that, and what's appropriate can vary between projects. We're not here to sell a specific methodology, but there needs to be some level of big picture work done first. And then in determining what that right scale is, how much is unknown, and what are the consequences if we get it wrong, if we're not having that right fit, particularly if we're doing a very iterative process where we're releasing quickly and we can address things early on. That's going to be less of an issue than if you're on a project where they're well, we're going to have demos weekly, but we're not actually showing it to end users or getting it in their hands until this distant point 9 months from now or something. Well, at that point, there's potential for so much rework that the big picture work strategically at the beginning becomes that much more important. So the small scale MVP, the quick releases, getting into the hands of users, having that active is very helpful. The sprint ahead model, or multiple sprints ahead, so that you've got some time for if a particular process does end up taking longer, that's, it's not going to cripple the next sprint for the development team. So personally, I like to have a couple of sprints ahead. And then another kind of core aspect here, which was brought up in the chat earlier, is just trust. So trust of designers as experts in their domain, trust that other people on the team know enough about design, that there doesn't have to be this kind of constant ongoing communication to try to sell the design process, or to be communicating of what's upcoming, which all of kind of leads to to designers needing to be explaining those things up front, being a leader in really explaining what to expect as the process goes through, identifying where people aren't going to have that level of knowledge and working directly with them, evangelizing where they need to, but trying to keep that contained and not have to be this constant thread throughout an entire project. Last thing I would say is a important piece for addressing this is those integrated teams. So when you've got a project where the development team is this contained agile team, multidisciplinary, and then there's a centralized design team that is servicing them kind of externally, it is a very tough fit. That hybrid model works a lot better, where somebody is really specifically assigned and working alongside that team, because the communication just is so weak when you've got a centralized design team that's really separated from it.
This has been awesome. Oh, and Erica just mentioned stakeholder interviews at the start of every project. It's a great way to spot inconsistent communication. Yeah. This is, I know we're running up to our hard stop, but I really think that this was incredible, and I appreciate our three panelists for being here and just being so willing to share their experiences, and for people in the chat to chime in and to commiserate or share their own experiences is really cool. Any last words from Eileen, Levi, Paul, and then anybody who has questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. We love hearing them.
No, just thanks everybody for coming. This was great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And thank you, Heather, for moderating here.
Yes.
Of course. And so, oh yeah, I really appreciate everybody. And one last thing, just know that Batovi has a community Slack, and we're always really excited if people, want to share ideas, experiences, and communicate with our design and UX team and even the devs. So that link I just threw in the chat, but really appreciate you guys. We're trying to make these a monthly thing. So keep an eye out on our socials, and we'll publicize those. And then thank you again, Eileen, Levi, and Paul. Really, really great to have you. Everybody have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.